All right, welcome back to the Intelligence Chapter. The Intelligence Chapter starts us off on a series of topics from intelligence to personality, psychological disorders, and social psychology, which all look very different from the first 8 chapters of the semester. For the first 8 chapters, we covered very basic components of psychological functioning, processes that never turn off, whether you're awake or asleep. These last 4 chapters that we cover all come from a separate historical approach. There are basic assumptions about how human beings function that are made back in the 1800s, and the fields are essentially created from those basic assumptions. So they developed before the point at which the basic foundations of psychology were laid, and the framework of these areas actually reflects some of that early 19th century thinking. So to understand how the field of intelligence is actually set up, we really have to look at some of the most basic historical components which lead to its development. Now, 1859 is a year I mentioned early in the semester you would see over and over again. And again, it shows up this time because after Darwin comes out with the theory of evolution, the primary theoretical approach in the late 1800s is that all of psychology is essentially based upon biology. More specifically, that it is genetics that primarily determines patterns of behavior. So the assumption is, that all of the physical characteristics you have, as well as all of the psychological traits that you have, are all completely determined by evolutionary theory, that is, genetics. So when Darwin comes out with this theory of evolution, the idea that all psychological characteristics are determined entirely by genes is the primary theoretical approach that most of the early biologists actually apply. And notice that I said early biologists because in 1859 there is no field of psychology. It is primarily the field of biology that makes the determination about the value of evolutionary theory, and as they discuss the physical size and claws and teeth and so forth that are related to animals, along with it are the basic characteristics of behavior for those patterns for those animals. And as the material from evolutionary theory eventually starts to be applied toward human beings, it is primarily the biologists that are actually doing that application. Psychology does not get started until 1879, and again, it is not based off of evolutionary theory. Psychology gets started because a biologist got a job in a philosophy department and did not want to do traditional philosophical work. So when Darwin's theory of evolution comes out in 1859, all physical and behavioral characteristics were assumed to be heritable. And it's not long, maybe about 20 years or so, before a fellow named Sir Francis Galton, who was actually Darwin's cousin, began to apply the first intelligence tests based off of the essential theory that intelligence is going to be a genetically based characteristic. But there are no intelligence tests in the 1880s that look like intelligence tests today. In fact, Galton relied on the very basics of the beginning of psychology at that time, reaction time studies, psychophysics, and as well as some additional measures that Galton himself will actually create. So in fact, Galton was actually the individual that created the Pearson correlation coefficient test that we worked with since Chapter 1. That is the R value. And the reason Galton created this mathematical test was to establish a mathematical correlation between two variables that he thought might be related to each other, but were not perfectly related to each other. So things like height and weight, as we've dealt with them before. Of course, generally, as people become taller, they do become heavier, but not in a perfect linear correspondence like you might expect to see in a physics course, where there would tend to be much less variability in the data that you work with. So Galton set up the first intelligence tests, and they tended to be based around simple measures of physical and sensory capacity. He took these measures and he placed them on normal distributions to establish where on a scale of all members of society did one particular person reside. And in fact, Galton did that quite a bit. In fact, he even had his intelligence testing booth, as much as it was intelligence testing, set up in places like carnivals, where a person would actually pay a penny. They would be run through a series of tests, and in the end, for their money, they were shown on a normal distribution approximately what was their relative standing to all other members of society. Reaction time was oftentimes used in Galton's tests because of a basic underlining of assumption about how your brain operates. It was assumed that intelligent individuals would probably have an efficiently designed neural architecture. Now keep this in mind, this is all very theoretical. Nobody knows anything about individual neural cells in the 1880s. They certainly do not know much about the role of circuitry in the brain. Just very general information at that time. So all of this is very much theoretical discussions about how things should operate. And so the assumption was intelligent people will theoretically have an efficiently designed neural architecture, and people that are much less smart should have a less well-designed neural architecture. If that were the case, it would then imply that any individual that had high intelligence should also have faster reaction time to basic stimuli. So in the 1880s, certainly by this point, reaction time studies had been set up, which if you look back at Chapter 1, were originally set up in the 1860s. And a person would be asked to sit in a chair at a table, a light would come on, and then they would press a button as quickly as possible. That very basic type of apparatus was used as a way to assess intelligence in these cases for Galton in the 1880s. And that's how intelligence tests really got started. Of course, you don't see intelligence tests look like this in any sense today, except maybe to some degree the reaction time tests, but they are always rolled into larger aspects of measures of behavior. Now, there's a separate set of events that occur in the early history of intelligence testing. Apart from the work that Darwin does in Great Britain and his cousin who's doing most of his work in London, and that is around 1905, the government in France decides to set up a public school system in Paris. And this public school system is designed in the same way that you know public school systems today, in that the government will collect taxes from everybody, set some money aside to fund the school system, and because that money is paid by public tax dollars, all members of society get to attend. So two of the people that are actually set up to start the original assessment of children coming into the school are Alfred Binet, who is an early psychologist. Notice it's 1905, so psychology has only been around for about 26 years. And Theodore Simon, who is a pediatrician. Binet and Simon work to create objective measures of children's scholastic skills, so that as children come into the public school system, they have to have a general idea of which classroom the children should be in. The advanced class, the slower class, the average class. and there's going to be a wide range of skill sets that children are going to have at that time. Some children will be the children of politicians, doctors, and lawyers. They may have already received tutoring at home, and there are going to be other children that are not that are not literate at all. Their parents are not literate, and they're going to be coming in to school for the very first time and have very poor skills. So Binet and Simon set up a standardized test to measure children's scholastic skills. This test is intended to be purely objective, just to measure what the children know. It is not making any assumption about any biologically based component of intelligence. It is only a very basic practical test to evaluate what the children actually know. Now, real quick, a question we can take a look at here that's related to this history is, which of the following psychologists created the Stanford-Binet IQ test? Now, we haven't mentioned the Stanford-Binet IQ test, so the answer might be on the next slide. And in fact, it is. The correct answer is going to be D, Lewis Terman. Now, the test that Binet and Simon create is written in French, which should make sense because they are in France. And in early international conferences on psychology, the test becomes widely known and gets taken by other individuals that are at the conferences back to their home countries and then translated. One of the first people to get a hold of the Binet-Simon test was a fellow named Henry Gardner, who translated it into English in 1908. Then another fellow, Lewis Terman, who was at Stanford University in California, converted that English version of the test into the Stanford-Binet IQ test in 1916. So in 1916, you actually have the very first standardized intelligence test in the English language, and it is created at Stanford University in California. The Stanford-Binet test is still around. It's now currently in its 5th edition. And as you might imagine, these tests have to be updated every 10 to 20 years or so, because as society changes, as the common vocabulary words that people use change, as technology changes, there are going to be different types of questions on IQ tests that reflect what's actually happening in society at that time. So certainly there would be very few questions about computer systems on a version of the Stanford-Binet from the 1950s, but there very well may be questions about social media on IQ tests today. Now, when the Stanford-Binet was originally created, the original intention by Terman was to work within the standard theoretical approach of the time, which was that all behavior was controlled by biological means, that is, genetics. And if genes were the primary contributor to intelligence, then the assumption was you should be able to assess the genetic contribution of intelligence by following intelligence through family lines. So, for example, if a mother and a father were both educated, their child should also have a high level of intelligence, and then the grandchild should also have a high level of intelligence, and that you should be able to track this high level of intelligence through the family line. And of course, that would also be true with individuals with low intelligence, that you would expect, based on the theorizing of the time, to see more individuals with psychological disorders or intellectual disabilities that would show up as a result of being the offspring of uneducated individuals. And of course, whether somebody was educated or not was not about whether or not they had access to education based on this early 20th century genetic theorizing. The idea that somebody had low intelligence was primarily because they had poor genes and therefore could not do well in school and therefore did not pursue an education. Now, when you take a look at the early definition of intelligence, intelligence tests get started in 1916. And here you'll see a quote from one of the earliest definitions of intelligence that have been used actually clear up to today. And that is, intelligence is defined as whatever an intelligence test measures. And that may seem like a really ridiculous definition. How could something just be whatever it does? It actually sounds kind of ridiculous. And this definition was created by a prominent psychologist in the United States named Edwin Boring in 1923. And notice, if he made this definition in 1923, it was because 7 years since 1916, intelligence tests have existed, but there has not actually been any clear and well-accepted definition of intelligence. This definition that Boring made was actually done out of frustration, which is actually something back in the 1920s psychologists would have recognized, that an intelligence test is measured as whatever an intelligence test measures is really a definition out of frustration. The idea that what constitutes intelligence is not widely accepted across psychologists. And in fact, many people are actually arguing what intelligence actually is. And in fact, almost every researcher has a different perspective of what intelligence actually should be. Therefore, every definition of intelligence is specific to an individual researcher, and so the field itself is actually struggling to define itself, to literally define itself, because you cannot get a widely accepted view of what intelligence is. Now, this definition of intelligence is actually very much of an embarrassment, and as time goes by, you start to see somewhat more of a cleaned up version of the definition of intelligence. That would be, now this comment here is one long statement, but I've chopped it up into 3 pieces so that you'll actually begin to recognize just what's happening here. The modern definition of intelligence is the ability to process sensory experiences and the ability to think flexibly with a large information set. That's actually 3 separate things. The ability to process sensory experiences is exactly what we talked about in the sensation perception chapter. In fact, we're not even talking about perception in this case, we're just dealing with the sensory aspect. The ability to think flexibly is actually the aspect of creativity. Now, we have not talked about creativity yet this semester, but creativity is actually a subfield of intelligence itself, and we will begin talking about it very shortly. And then last, with a large information set, what chapter did we already cover that talked about your ability to remember a large information set? The memory chapter, of course. So we actually have 3 entirely separate topics: sensation, creativity, and memory. And if the modern definition of intelligence involves 3 separate processes, then intelligence is, by definition, not one system, but rather a combination of 3 systems. And whenever you have a process in psychology which is created by multiple systems that will all be labeled under one umbrella term, it's referred to as a construct. And the idea of a construct is something we're going to see quite a bit of for the rest of the semester, because this chapter, intelligence, deals with constructs, and as does all the remaining chapters that we cover, such as personality, psychological disorders, and social psychology, all very consistently deal in large-scale ways with constructs. So what's important to recognize in this case, and in fact one very practical piece of information that comes out of this, is the idea that intelligence is one process is absolutely an incorrect idea. And in fact, when you hear faulty information through science journalists that somebody had found the gene for intelligence, that kind of reporting is absolutely incorrect. There's not going to be a gene for intelligence. And the reason is, at an absolute minimum, intelligence must involve these three components that we're looking at under the modern definition: sensory processing, creativity, and memory. And each of those systems actually have to involve at least, at a minimum, 3 genes. And in fact, of course, if you're dealing with sensory experiences, and we know we have 6 sensory inputs into your brain, that's 6 separate genes there. Not even talking about all the myriad genes that would be related to establishing a receptor, apart from setting up the pathways into and out of the brain. You're only just talking about this in a very general sense. So 6 separate genes for the 6 sensory inputs. If we were to be really silly about this and say there's 1 gene for creativity, which seems very unlikely, that would just be a 7th gene. And then, having covered the memory chapter, it's almost certain that there's going to be more than 1 gene related to the entire information processing system that we talked about in that chapter. But if we just play the game that memory is 1 gene, then that's up to 8. 8 genes minimum just to establish intelligence. So the idea that intelligence is one unitary idea and can be controlled by 1 gene itself is absolutely incorrect. Now, a question about intelligence. Given what we've already said, how about this question? Intelligence is a well-defined characteristic measured by similar measures across cultures. I'll give you a minute to pause the video, and then I'll come back with the answer. The correct answer is false. Intelligence is not a well-defined characteristic measured by similar measures across cultures. In fact, intelligence still today is argued over what it actually constitutes. So even if we flip back to the modern definition of intelligence, the modern definition of intelligence gets us away from the older version of intelligence from 1923 from Edwin Boring, which sounds very frustrated and problematic. Intelligence is defined as whatever an intelligence test measures. That can't be right. So to clean it up, intelligence researchers use the modern definition of intelligence. But there's still debate about the modern definition of intelligence as well. And we will have to continue to talk about the process of defining intelligence and to see what different researchers use to include in the story of intelligence before we can actually find how intelligence is defined, at least in North America, and how it might be defined elsewhere in the world. But that gets us back to this basic question. Intelligence is not well defined, and it most certainly is not measured by similar measures across cultures unless you take one measure and insist on using it across cultures. But each culture that exists may define intelligence in slightly different ways, and as a result, you'll wind up with many, many different definitions of intelligence. But that does get us to a question about how intelligence is understood. And intelligence researchers are oftentimes trying to get at very similar types of topics. And that is especially for industrialized Western society, there tends to be an approach that most people tend to push. But again, that is not going to be consistent worldwide. If you press intelligence researchers into what they're really trying to get, most of them will tell you that intelligence will involve 3 things. The first being that you have to be able to learn a large amount of something. Secondly, you have to be able to use it creatively. And third, in a short period of time. That is, intelligence is always reflected, this is at least in Western industrialized societies, always reflected by your ability to learn a great deal about something and then be able to use that information creatively in a short period of time. And if you look for those three characteristics, most people in North America would say, yes, that looks like intelligent behavior. And one of the nice examples that I have to show this is a brief clip from the movie Apollo 13. In this particular clip, what you have is a series of NASA scientists trying to figure out how to get the lunar module back to Earth to save the lives of the 3 astronauts. And what you see in the end is a lot of what most people would typically consider high degree of intelligent behavior.
From this moment on, we are improvising a new mission.
Oh, come on.
Sorry, we'll get to look at that. How do we get our people home? They are here. We turn them around, straight back, direct abort.
No, sir. We get them on a free return trajectory. It's the option with the fewest question marks for safety.
I agree with Jerry. Use the moon's gravity, slingshot them around.
No, the LEM will not support 3 guys for that amount of time. I mean, we have got to do a direct abort. We do an about face, we bring the guys right home right now.
Get them back soon, absolutely.
We don't even know if the Odyssey's engine's even working, and if there's been serious damage to this spacecraft.
They blow up and they die.
That is not the argument. We're talking about time, not whether or not these guys...
I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you.
Hey, hold it. Let's hold it down. Let's hold it down, people. The only engine we've got with enough power for a direct abort is the SPS on the service module. What Lovell has told us, it could have been damaged in an explosion, so let's consider that engine dead. We light that thing up, could blow the whole works. It's just too risky. We're not going to take that chance. In fact, the only thing the command module is good for is re-entry, so that leaves us with the LEM, which means free return trajectory. Once we get the guys around the moon, we'll fire up the LEM engine, make a long burn, pick up some speed, and get them home as quick as we can. So let's get to work. Let's lay it out. You're telling me you can only give our guys 45 hours? That brings them to about there. Gentlemen, that's not acceptable.
We got to turn everything off. Now. They're not going to make it to re-entry.
What do you mean, everything?
With everything on, the LEM draws 60 amps. At that rate, in 16 hours, the batteries are dead, not 45. And so's the crew. We got to get them down to 12 amps. We got to turn off. We have to turn off the radars, cabin heater, instrument displays, the guidance computer, the whole smack.
Whoa, guidance computer. What if they need to do another burn? Gene, they won't even know which way they're pointed.
The more time we talk down here, the more juice they waste up there. I've been looking at the data for the past hour.
That's the deal?
That's the deal.
Okay, John. Minute we finish the burn, we'll power down the LEM.
All right.
Now, in the meantime, we're going to have a frozen command module up there. In a couple days, we're going to have to power it up using nothing but the re-entry batteries.
Never been tried before.
Well, we're going to have to figure it out. I want you guys to find every engineer who designed every switch, every circuit, every transistor, and every light bulb that's up there. Then I want you to talk to the guy in the assembly line who actually built the thing. Find out how to squeeze every amp out of both of these goddamn machines. I want this mark all the way back to Earth with time to spare. We never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option.
We have a situation brewing with the carbon dioxide.
We had a CO2 filter problem on the lunar module.
5 filters on the LEM.
Which were meant for 2 guys for a day and a half. So I told the doc...
You're already up to 8 on the gauges. Anything over 15 and you get impaired judgment, blackouts, the beginnings of brain asphyxia.
What about the scrubbers on the command module?
We take square cartridges.
The ones on the LEM are round.
Tell me this isn't a government operation.
This just isn't a contingency we've remotely looked at.
Those CO2 levels are going to be getting toxic.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Rapidly.
Listen up. People upstairs handed us this one, and we got to come through. We got to find a way to make this fit into the hole for this using nothing but that. So let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee going too, someone.
Okay, the very final scene that you see in this clip involves a bunch of engineers looking at material that exists on the spacecraft itself. Because if the engineers down on Earth find a way to generate more oxygen on the spacecraft, but it involves material that only exists on Earth, it is not a solution that would be of any value to the astronauts. So they take all the material that the astronauts actually have on the space capsule, and they take it out and they place it on a table, and they try to evaluate in what way they could use it to generate more oxygen. And of course they do, because this story actually played itself out and the astronauts were saved, in part because of the efforts. But what you're actually seeing on that table is so many things that are mismatched and seem to be unrelated to the generation of oxygen, that the problem would involve a great deal of creativity. And remember, that was part of one of the aspects that we were talking about in terms of that modern definition of intelligence. You have to learn a lot about something, which engineers should know a lot about engineering for aeronautics. They have to be able to use the information creatively, which is what they're actively doing on the table, in a short period of time. I mean, the definition works perfectly for the scenario. The engineers know more about engineering than anybody. Now they have to have a creative solution in a very brief period of time, because time's wasting and the astronauts will die from brain asphyxiation if they don't get this job done. Now, what would actually be on an intelligence test? Well, actually, an intelligence test tends to have very common types of material on it. In fact, so common that you may not even realize it. Most intelligence tests, the most popular ones, tend to have material that is pulled directly off of academic environments such as high school. And in fact, most of the popular IQ tests are really nothing more than a 3-hour summary of everything you learned in high school. It's essentially the same thing as like the SAT. And in fact, the SAT and an intelligence test are actually very, very similar. In fact, they're so similar that it's perfectly appropriate to refer to the SAT as an intelligence test. And in fact, that's a story that we'll deal with as we go along, but an intelligence test and the SAT are essentially designed the same way. There are minor differences between them, but the tests are so similar that you can actually take your SAT value and convert it directly into an IQ score. Or if you had taken a specific intelligence test, there are conversion routines that will immediately transfer that number into an expected SAT value. So why is high school information placed on intelligence tests? Well, the basic answer is a social answer. If you're trying to evaluate intelligence from all members of society, and you're trying to evaluate the amount of information people have learned, how they could use it creatively in a short period of time, what is the most basic format of information you could deal with? Well, the most basic information is going to be the common expected school information everyone gets exposed to. That is, most people will go through school all the way up to high school. Right? About 25% of people will move on to college after that, and it'll just be a continual decline from degree after degree after that. In fact, even of the 25% that move on to college, of course, a sizable portion of those individuals will even drop out or not finish their bachelor's degree. But most of society gets through a high school diploma. You can use an IQ test that is based off of high school information as a common way to assess all members of society. In fact, it is expected that for a person that engages their classes, does their homework, and keeps high grades in high school, very likely has a high IQ. And for somebody that simply does not like high school, cuts class, doesn't do their homework, doesn't read their textbooks, will probably have low grades in high school, but subsequently will wind up with a low value of an IQ on an IQ test. And that's because the material that you're taught in high school is essentially the same material that's going to wind up on the IQ test itself. So one of the basic questions that kind of been passed around for a very long time, people still argue a little bit about, although it's clearer how things actually operate now, is that for a person that stays in school for a longer period of time, do they have a higher IQ with more education because they have better genes and do well in school and therefore have a higher IQ naturally? Or is it the actual exposure to school that pulls their IQ up? Actually, there's a constant back and forth between these processes, and it depends on the components of intelligence that you actually evaluate and how things influence each other. So there are traits that seem to be somewhat derived from genes that give you an interest in particular areas, and if you enjoy that interest, you'll simply engage in it more. But of course, from an environmental standpoint, you have to have the opportunity to engage in that type of material. So just like with anything else in psychology, genes will be important, but also the environment will be. And you have to have some of the basic interest and aptitude for the particular skill set, and then have an opportunity to practice it afterward. So if we ask this question, intelligence tests can only have academic information on them as well as some puzzle type problems. So this sounds just like a question that comes right off of what we were talking about. I will stop for a moment, let you pause the video, and think about this question. Okay, and the correct answer is false. It does sound very much like what I was just saying from the previous slide. Intelligence tests have mostly information from high school, and that absolutely is true. However, we were also discussing the issues about how to define intelligence back here a couple of slides before that, and that's still an issue currently. So what's going to happen in this case is intelligence tests, because they are defined by a intelligence construct, which can be defined by different researchers or by different societies in slightly different ways. Not everybody measures intelligence from the same scholastic standpoint as we do in North America. In fact, there may be other ways to measure intelligence. And in fact, even in North America, the tests will vary as well. Here is a short list of other types of information that wind up on intelligence tests. Athletic skill. Now, athletic skill is a very odd one. You've probably never heard of an IQ test that measures your ability to do math, to define vocabulary words, and then has you run a 100-yard dash. Not typical. But we actually did cover this back in the developmental chapter. Back in the sensory motor stage, one of the aspects that was being evaluated on an intelligence test was to see whether or not a child could hop on one foot. And that is a motor skill development process that you would look at an early age, but not typically in an adult. And in this scenario, when you have a motor skill being evaluated, It is essentially an athletic skill. Mostly motor coordination issues develop early on in life, and so you would tend to see motor coordination issues measured in younger children rather than adults, but you could still apply it in adults to get a broader view of the characteristics that the person had developed. Aspects of creativity, as I've mentioned, are part of intelligence itself. Emotional intelligence, which oftentimes gets a lot of play on talk shows, is generally misrepresented on talk shows. Emotional intelligence really refers to a person's ability to detect and reflect back the emotional state of another individual. So if you can tell that somebody else is sad and then reflect back sadness to that individual, it generally gives you a greater capacity to interact with that individual. And that's primarily what emotional intelligence is about. It was an aspect of intelligence that was developed sometime around the early 1990s. Musical ability goes back at least to the 1930s. You commonly see this still today in times where a musical prodigy, such as a 3-year-old, will start playing piano, will start playing Mozart. Having never touched a piano before, they will hear Mozart, they will see a piano, they'll play with it a little bit, and in a short period of time, they will just start playing. And as bizarre as that sounds, that actually does happen. And it is a process witnessed very much by people hundreds of years ago and has been incorporated into the story of intelligence at a very early state. Social intelligence. Social intelligence is one of the last components that were actually added to the whole intelligence construct. Social intelligence is related to your ability to manage other individuals. So, for example, a person with high social intelligence would probably be someone like a chief executive officer. The job of a CEO is to kind of oversee the entire operation of the factory or the organization, and they would have to motivate people to do a lot of work and make other individuals down the line in the entire administration, right down to the individuals that work on the factory floor, to be engaged in their work. That amount of management of people would involve a high degree of social intelligence. So people you would expect to have high levels of social intelligence, CEO, a president, anybody who is essentially a high-level manager should have high social intelligence. The very last bullet point here, speed in processing sensory input, that actually comes from Sir Francis Galton all the way back in the 1880s. That was a process that was one of the first measures of intelligence before we had the more standardized Stanford-Binet intelligence test of today. But it's still around, as I mentioned earlier, because that concept of a efficiently designed architecture in your brain that leads to faster response speeds or faster reaction times is actually still a concept that people play with today, and it is still part of the broader aspect of intelligence research. Now, so far we've been talking about intelligence as one primary overarching functional process. But that process has actually run into many problems over the years. And in fact, one of the alternate ways to view intelligence is to break it up into multiple units. In fact, to refer to intelligence as being related to multiple components. And that's what this fellow Gardner has done. You'll see how Gardner has taken the concept of intelligence, broken it down into multiple constructs, smaller constructs than the broader construct we've already been talking about, and applying it into different scenarios where people may have high level of intelligence in one sub-construct, but less ability in the others. Intelligence itself has traditionally been explained by two contrasting theories. One is general intelligence, which is generally referred to as G, and the other one is trait intelligence, which is oftentimes referred to as S. Although on a practical basis, I think most people refer to G, but they don't walk around talking about S. They'll talk about G versus trait intelligence. The concept of general intelligence, or G, was designed in 1927 by a person named Spearman. Now, keep this in mind. This is 11 years after the beginning of the first intelligence test. So this is a very early point in the research on intelligence, after which there was a formal intelligence test, that being the Stanford-Binet. Now, the idea of general intelligence came from statistical evaluations of the results from intelligence research back at that time, which showed that there were a subset of questions on an intelligence test that tended to cluster together. And when I say cluster together, that is that they all had a high degree of correlation between them. And Spearman pulled those questions out and referred to them as their own category, representing general intelligence. And that's where the idea comes from. General intelligence is supposed to be kind of a subcomponent of the broader concept of intelligence itself. And everyone should reflect some degree of general intelligence, from low up to high, and the degree of general intelligence that a person has should wind up being able to be measured, and it should also influence many of the other aspects of intelligence in their life. So for a person that has high general intelligence, they should have a greater capacity to learn things in general, and a person with low general intelligence should have more difficulty in a general sense learning about anything. Now, one contrasting idea that is shown empirically is that there are people with high degrees of trait intelligence. That is, they'll have one specific highly developed skill despite the fact that they may have low or average skill capacity in all other measures. And that is the trait intelligence concept. S can refer to specific ability or savant, if you wish. In fact, that's oftentimes where the concept of trait intelligence is applied, where you talk about an individual who might be a musical savant, such as a 3-year-old who has never played a piano or a musical instrument, who hears Mozart and then literally sits down at a piano and in 5-10 minutes actually starts duplicating the music that he or she had actually heard. And as strange as that is, that actually does happen. Trait intelligence oftentimes shows up in any scenario where you hear about savants. Savants show up in select areas of intellectual functioning, which we'll be talking about. But one of the things about savants that oftentimes is presented incorrectly through the mass media is that most savants are perfectly average individuals. They have normal intelligence, normal social abilities. You would not notice that they had any savant skill whatsoever if you had met them, except they do have that one specific highly developed skill. Very consistently, in contrast, the people in the media focus on savants that also have some sort of intellectual disability or might have a severe form of autism, so that you wind up with an individual who displays a great deal of musical capacity, for example, but can't tie their shoes, can't pass the 3rd grade, doesn't know how to use a toaster. Those are the kinds of things that oftentimes science journalists tend to over-accentuate and dramatize as part of their storyline, although it gives you a corrupted view of who actually is a savant. Okay, try to answer this question. The concept of G, that is general intelligence, is metaphorically similar to, go ahead and pause and see if you can come up with the answer. Okay, and the correct answer actually is A, computer processor speed. The idea of general intelligence implies that there is an underlying process which affects all things that you learn. And if that process runs very efficiently, then you should learn more rapidly. And if it runs inefficiently, then you would learn more slowly. So as a result, it is most closely related to things like computer processor speed. So if you had two laptops, one that was designed in 1980 and another one that was designed in 2020, and you had to do a great deal of computing work, of course the one from 2020 would be much faster, and it would get the work done much more quickly. And in fact, it would be so much faster that a person using the 2020 computer would be able to get a lot more work done and actually reach many more conclusions and therefore gain more knowledge much more rapidly than a person using the laptop from 1980, who would struggle learning the material relative to the other computer and would learn information more slowly and then simply just have less information overall. And this, in a general way, is the metaphorical way in which intelligence is oftentimes described by people that promote the general intelligence idea. That all of our IQs are actually based upon the underlying process by how efficient general intelligence operates, and therefore people with a more efficient or quicker general intelligence simply learn more information over time and therefore have higher IQs because they acquire more information per day over the course of years and simply wind up with more knowledge. Now, the contrasting idea is S, that refers to special abilities or savant syndrome. And savant syndrome actually shows up in only one of four categories. Outside of this range, if you don't see it on this list, there is no such thing as a savant for that area. So, for example, there are savants for mathematics, for artwork, which I use as drawing and sculpting as being the common examples, music, and memory. But even in each of these four topics, there are specific types of skills in there that we're going to take a look at, but it does not involve all aspects of math or all aspects of artwork or all aspects of music, for example. They are specifically related to particular components of those areas. But before we start to look at those particular areas, what are some of the things you don't see there? Psychology, right? There's no such thing as a savant for psychology. No such thing. Cooking. Is cooking on there? No. So there's no such thing as a savant for cooking. So even somebody who's referred to as a master chef and may have lots of awards over the course of years simply does not fit the category for being a savant. No one sees 3-year-olds with the capacity to fry steak and make a twice-baked potato and so forth in the same way that a 3-year-old might actually sit in front of a piano and begin playing it. It simply doesn't exist. So there's only 4 areas, and that's very important for you to keep in mind, because as we get done these areas, it's going to tell us something very important about how your brain is structured and how the process of intelligence actually plays itself out. Now for mathematics. In mathematics, there's actually only 2 subcomponents of mathematics that show a savant ability. The first is arithmetic calculating. That is, you can ask a person, what is the cube root of 69,372? And then they could give you a good answer, maybe even within 4 decimal places. It's really a rather remarkable skill. If you ask the person how they do it, they're going to tell you that they don't know. They might just tell you that they kind of get an impression, or they might see a number inside their head and know that it's correct. But that's it. Arithmetic calculation. The other component of a savant level skill in mathematics is calendar calculating. Notice that these are both aspects of calculating. In calendar calculating, you could ask a person such a vague question as, on what day of the week will St. Patrick's Day be in the year 4229? And they will immediately tell you it's going to be a Tuesday or a Thursday or some other such day. That's actually something you can check because, of course, calendars repeat themselves, and there are computer programs that will automatically give you that information. These individuals just can give you the answer automatically. And certainly being able to check their ability to do calendar calculating and arithmetic calculating are things that are related to tests in which you can verify the skill itself. And that's very important in this scenario. Notice, though, that you don't have a capacity for abstract reasoning in mathematics. So for anybody that's actually a savant in mathematics is no more likely to become a math professor than anybody else from our classroom. To get to the level of mathematics professor, you have to deal with a lot of abstract concepts. And abstract concepts are not a part of what you would refer to as a savant in mathematics. You simply do not see savants with abstract reasoning skills in mathematics. There are certainly people that deal with abstract reasoning in mathematics much better than the rest of us, so that they are at the high end of the skill set, but they do not fit the proper definition of savant. And where you wind up as a savant is actually a specific component where it's going to place you along the normal distribution in a particular area. And that is something we have yet to talk about. Drawing and sculpting are components that were actually related to the whole idea of photographic memory. For an individual who is a drawing savant or a sculpting savant, the way you assess this is not by the creativity of their work, but rather their ability to draw or sculpt an object or scene that they only get to witness for a short period of time, like 30 seconds. So for example, you could take a person to the top of the Empire State Building, blindfolded, and then let them look at the cityscape of Manhattan for 30 seconds, and then quickly take them off the roof and bring them inside and let them draw what they saw. They will be able to draw reasonably accurately all of the rooftops and the heights of the buildings and all the things in relation to each other very, very well, even after only having seen it for 30 seconds. It's actually this type of skill way back in the 1960s that led to the idea that there might be such a thing as a photographic memory. But hopefully you do remember from the memory chapter that as research on photographic memory progressed, it was found that no one ever shows an ability to see a scene and not show any decay from that visual memory. Everyone, no matter how good they are, show decay in visual memory. And as a result, the idea of a photographic memory or eidetic memory had to be dropped. And so it's not a thing anymore. Even though on television you still hear about people being identified as having photographic or eidetic memories, they simply do not. The one other aspect of this as well, just similar to the story with mathematics, is you're looking at this person's ability to do a very basic underlying skill. Copy something. In mathematics, you were just doing very low-level types of mathematics, calculating. In terms of drawing or sculpting, you're just copying an object, and you're retaining it in visual memory. But you are not being identified as a savant because of your creative skill. It is your ability to copy something, and that's it. Music takes place in the same way. A savant in music is an individual who will wind up being able to copy musical tunes on a piano or other musical instrument very rapidly with very little training or no training at all. But it again is their ability to copy, not to create new types of musical scores or new symphonies, but rather simply the ability to copy. And the same thing again happens in memory as well, in which a person just repeats an event that had actually occurred. And in fact, specifically, the memory savant is the person with the autobiographical memory, that or as we refer to it in the memory chapter, episodic memory. An individual that can remember in great detail components of their life throughout their life in over the course of years. So if you could ask a person, where were you 10 years ago? And they would say, okay, 10 years ago, we were visiting my cousin's family in Cincinnati. And then you could say, and what were you doing on March 15th on that day when you were there? And they'll say, well, they could recount the entire day for you. Now, if they gave you a recounting of what they did at their cousin's house 10 years ago, it would be almost impossible to actually justify their comments as actually being correct, right? Because who knows what they really did. But you can ask them questions about what was the weather in your neighborhood in Cincinnati on March 15th, 10 years ago? And then they can tell you. And if you ask these types of questions consistently about what they saw on television, what was the weather, when did an event occur, you can actually develop an entire picture of a series of very accurate answers to these types of questions, in which case you would be able to justify the comment that they have a very high degree of episodic memory, which is also called autobiographical memory. Savants in all cases have very specific types of skill sets. For mathematics, it's arithmetic calculating or calendar calculating. For drawing or sculpting, it is just copying something from visual memory. For musical savants, a person will copy something from auditory memory, and in memory systems themselves is specific to episodic memory. And these are the only areas in which you wind up seeing savant level skills. And in savant level skills, we haven't really described exactly what defines it, but it is a skill level that we'll see later on described on the normal distribution, which establishes a very high level of skill relative to everybody else. One example that we can see of savants comes from an individual with a high level of musical capacity to copy music. And notice in this video, the woman who was the savant has virtually no capacity to understand the formal components of music. She simply can copy the music that she hears, but she can do it very, very well.
Across the country in Costa Mesa, California, here's another family where the father is also a scientist who also has a child with a brain disorder.
As you can see, Gloria has a classically trained voice. One of my favorite songs is called O Mio Babino Caro. What does that mean, Gloria?
Oh, my beloved daddy.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, and it's Italian. It's by who?
Puccini.
Okay.
again, you can't see any obvious problem. She is singing a sophisticated aria from memory in a foreign language. But at the same time, if you ask her to tie her shoes or write her name, for her that would be very hard.
Can Gloria today subtract 7 from 10 and get 3?
Gloria cannot subtract. Anything.
Cannot.
No, maybe 1 or 2. She doesn't subtract.
Gloria has a condition called Williams syndrome. It begins with a tiny mistake in the genes that leads to a most peculiar consequence.
Lovely. Thank you.
Your voice is very pretty.
Yes, it is. But Gloria also has an IQ of only 65.
And therefore, the professionals call them retarded, and they're put in all these retarded classes. And maybe that's where they belong at first. But then we find a lot of strengths they have.
Most particularly, Howard Lenhoff says his daughter is intensely musical. She has memorized 2,000 songs in 25 languages. And years ago, thinking like the scientist he was, Howard said, there is something missing, yes, but there is also something special about my daughter. This is a talent that maybe she could use later.
Yeah? Wait, don't do it. Let Brooke do it. Say, what is that? Is it G?
G.
Okay.
To earn a living, to make a life. And so he has pushed and pushed his daughter.
G. What is it?
A minor.
What is it?
A minor.
No.
B minor.
No.
D minor.
E minor.
Do me a favor.
There are still so many things she can't understand.
This could be harder for her.
And Howard hasn't that much time. He's 70.
This is the major question. You ask any person of a parent of a handicapped child, what is their greatest concern is what will happen to them after we die. And while we're here, we can handle things.
And as I mentioned, in terms of savant syndrome, people always wind up in the same areas of savant skill: math, drawing, music, or memory. And this also even happens not like the case that you just witnessed, where a person was born with the savant level of skill, but rather something else called acquired savant syndrome, where a person will wind up with brain damage as a result of a stroke or a head injury, and then actually become a savant afterward. So in a way, to say it in a somewhat comical manner, it's almost like a superhero power in this case, where instead of getting bit by a radioactive spider and becoming Spider-Man, you get hit in the head, go in a coma, and then come out with it with one of these savant level skills. And of course, you don't get to pick the one that you get, but you may wind up with one. And in fact, there are examples of all of those scenarios occurring in math, drawing, music, and memory for individuals that have received brain damage who were never savants themselves to begin with their entire life until the time that they got brain damage. And as a result, they became savants. But the savant skill is always the same set that we already covered. And that's actually telling you something about how the brain is constructed, that there are going to be specific areas that can be damaged that will always wind up placing a person in one of those subsets of intellectual capacity. But nobody becomes a psychology savant or a cooking savant or a chemistry savant or a biology savant or a sociology savant. None of those things ever exist. They always exist in the same areas: math, drawing, music, and memory, with each of those subtypes of calculation, visual memory copying, auditory memory copying, or autobiographical memory.
He's also found around 30 truly bizarre cases where people were transformed into savants, seemingly overnight.
These are people who have an injury or a disease, and all of a sudden some ability cascades forth, which was never there before.
He calls them acquired savants, and they represent some of the most mysterious cases in the field of brain science. One of them is Derek Amato. He became a pianist after a severe head injury.
So let me get this straight. You dived into a swimming pool and hit your head on the bottom. You came to a week later, and what?
Derek started to suffer from headaches and memory loss that still plague him today. But then something unexpected happened. Barely a week after the accident, he was hit with an uncontrollable need to play the piano. He sat for hours playing this melody over and over again.
And that's what it was.
And you weren't a piano player?
No.
So what I'd love to know is how you picture and think about music, because when I learn a piece of music, I generally look at the sheet music, and each note is on a line or a space, and it represents one of the keys on the piano, and I learn it that way until I can. So that's all written out by the composer, specifically?
That would take me a year to learn, maybe 5.
Wow, so do you read sheet music?
No, I see blocks. I see these black and white squares nonstop.
These blocks tell his fingers how to play that melody.
Something kind of miraculous happened to your brain when it hit the bottom of the pool.
Right.
But what? Why do people like Derek develop savant-like abilities after a head injury?
So let's lead into the next question. The last 2 films you just watched show evidence for what type of intelligence? And of course the correct answer there is trait intelligence, because both the savant level of skills, whether you were born with the skill or whether or not it was acquired later on, are both specifically related to trait intelligence. So what actually is intelligence? Well, because intelligence is a construct, I can tell you right now that there is no final answer. And if you're looking for exactly what is intelligence, the answer is, I don't know, and neither does anybody else. In fact, the reason why I can say nobody can actually say what it is simply is an issue that goes back to the fact that intelligence is a construct. If intelligence is a construct, it doesn't exist unless you, as a human being, decide that intelligence is a thing, and then you select which characteristics make it. But it doesn't exist as a normal, basic, underlying biological function. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because a lot of debate over intelligence and what it means and whether it's related to genetics or environment and so forth is oftentimes overly dramatized in an inappropriate way through the media, and it completely misses the point of what intelligence actually is. But given the construct that we have for North America and most of the westernized, industrialized societies, the concept of intelligence is relatively similar. Not exactly always the same, but relatively similar. And that's basically the format that we're going to work with. Now, intelligence itself can be categorized into 2 general types: fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence are given those names because they reflect the ability of intelligence to adapt to a particular scenario, just the way a fluid would fit any container you put it in, because it flows and it will adapt to any shape it's in. And crystals are going to have a very rigid shape and will not change. So fluid intelligence is the name in which you would generally think about a person's ability to think flexibly. But that is, be creative. And in fact, fluid intelligence is directly related to the whole capacity of being creative and how that process exists over the course of your lifetime. Crystallized intelligence tends to be related to basic recall or recognition of facts and events. And to be very clear about this, your ability to recall or recognize facts or events is specifically from the memory chapter called declarative memory. Anything that you can declare with language is declarative memory, and that is exactly what crystallized intelligence is. It's a process of building up facts and experiences over the course of your life that you'll remember. So it builds up over the course of your lifetime, and of course it's going to be positively correlated with your age. The older you are, the more facts and events you'll be exposed to, the more vocabulary words you'll be exposed to, the more information you'll actually have to contribute at a later age. And so crystallized intelligence tends to increase over the course of your lifespan. Now, if we talk about crystallized and fluid intelligence and apply it in a way that many of you may have actually seen, we can ask this question. When Grandpa tells the same stories about his life over and over and again, it reflects what kind of intelligence? The correct answer there is going to be crystallized intelligence. Grandpa tells you stories about his life. The stories about his life are declarative memory. It's a part of declarative memory is episodic memory. You experience something and then you can talk about it. So for example, a declarative memory that you will have is you were a teenager when you started college. These are a couple of things that are probably true for any one of you. And that's a fact that will not change because it's already occurred and it will remain a fact for the rest of your life. So it will become crystallized intelligence, referred to as crystallized because it's a fact that won't change. And you'll tell the same story over and over again throughout your life.